Exultet Gaudium.
So welcome to the show. This is our first episode.
It's our first episode.
We've never done this before. Can you? The audience is like, yeah, we can tell. You're really not great. We promise to get better with time. This is the first time we've talked in front of microphones like this.
It's true.
Mm-hmm.
It is true.
It is. So this is the first episode of the
Heart Speaks to Heart podcast.
The Heart Speaks to Heart podcast, product of Three Hearts Homestead. For more information, you can check us out at threeheartshomestead.com.
Or on our YouTube channel.
Which has not been made yet, but by the time this comes out, it will be, and there will be links in the description of wherever this is found. What a weird world this is that we've just walked into. Podcasting.
I don't know. It's a strange one, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's true. So, for our inaugural episode,
we are going to be talking about community.
Yes, community, dear listeners, community.
And the many facets therein.
Yeah, so I know I've had a lot of thoughts that hit me in the middle of the night while I'm at work, when I'm supposed to be thinking exclusively and explicitly when I'm supposed to be thinking about other things. But that's just the nature of the beast, I feel like, is that I'm never thinking about what I'm supposed to be thinking about at a given time. It's just not my nature, apparently.
That's fair. I have the opposite struggle, honestly, unless it's 12 o'clock at night. I'm supposed to be sleeping because the child is asleep, and then...
It's really weird when it comes to my decision-making ability. My decision-making ability is fascinating to tap into because most people, I feel like normal people, or at least people with like well-formed decision-making capabilities, kind of weigh the pros and cons, and they enter into this like liminal space, right? Of like they're on the threshold, they have all the facts that they're going to have. The only thing that hasn't happened yet is those facts, those knowledge having been like processed into an actual decision and moving forward with that. And most people like can take that leap of faith actively and immediately and move from I'm content with the fact that I'm not going to get any more information about this by lollygagging and dragging my feet. Let's just do this. I can't do that. And it's not that I'm dragging my feet about more information. It's that I like that process of processing the information into a decision. I think I am literally the definition of like the sleep on it. Like the phrase sleep on it, I think I'm the personification of that because like I will have a data set of information and pros and cons that need weighing, and then I'll go do something entirely irrelevant. I'll read a book, I'll do work, I'll go to sleep. And then I'll just realize at some point that I've reached a decision. Like somehow my brain will have weighed those pros and cons. But if I'm actively thinking about it, it won't happen. My analysis paralysis will come in where I'll be like, well, this pro is really worth like a 0.5 in my head, and this con's worth like a -1, so like, that's not great. And what's it really? I mean, could I live without that? Could I sacrifice that? What if that 0.5 is really more of a 0.4? And I can't actively think about decision making. I just exist, and then suddenly I'm doing it. I'm existing as the thing that I'm trying to do, as the decision that I've somehow made.
And is that how it happened when you discerned that we were supposed to get married? Because I know
yes.
what to deal with, so
I mean,
I
no.
don't know how
So,
that went.
so that was more active because it wasn't so much, it was me making a decision. But it was also me just trying to discern what God wanted, and trying to see what, like, it wasn't me necessarily like trying to form my own will so much as it was trying to discern what God's will was. I knew he had already had a decision in mind. So in almost like a weird sense, my decision-making capabilities were a little different because at that point, like, it almost felt like God was the decision maker there more than I was. And so that puts me in a different headspace. Even though that's not like a great That's not how like decision making works, right? Like theologically, philosophically, psychologically, like I'm no less of the decision maker. Like I chose to marry you, like that's my choice. So like any theologians that are listening to this, and all those millions of theologians who listen to my podcast, right? The angry ones too, the ones that get very bent out of shape with pitchforks that are waiting outside my house. All of them, I beg your forgiveness, because that was not a theologically accurate claim. That was me trying to explain an experience, and how I experience it. Because that's not how the will works or how the intellect works. Especially in relation to God, we do have wills, separate from God's will.
I think a more concise way to put it might be that sometimes his will is a lot louder and easier to discern than at other times.
That's true. That's true.
So sometimes it is so apparent what he wants you to do.
Yeah.
That if you're open to the movements he makes in your heart and you're willing to make those jumps and leaps of faith, then it can feel in a sense that the decision has been made for you, even if you're actively making the decision, having that active will. In the discernment process, you're just molding yourself and conforming yourself more to his will because you can feel it and hear it more clearly in those moments than others.
I'd agree with that. Yeah. Sometimes listening to God's will can be super complicated, and you're just like, what do you mean? What do you want from me? Give me the answer. And then other times making that decision is like making the decision to believe that the sun's going to come up in the morning. Like, is that really a decision? You know the sun's going to come up. Like, sometimes God's will is just that apparent that you just kind of have to move with it, unless you really want to put your feet in the dirt and dig in and
That's
fight
true.
that.
Which brings us to our topic today, which is community. Yes,
so community. Yeah, that's been something that's been on your and my heart for a while now. My heart's for a while now.
A very long while.
It's kind of the stage of life that we're in, right? Like, for anyone who doesn't know, we're in our 20s.
Some of us later 20s than others.
Midder 20s than others.
Almost later 20s.
One day. Some of us midder 20s than others. And trying to figure out how this whole life thing's going to work, because we jumped through a lot of hoops really quick. College graduation, marriage, kids, not necessarily in that order, depending on which one of us you talk to.
That's true.
Graduating at different times. And like the idea of people sticking around when you live in a college town and are leaving a college town, and everyone else is constantly coming into or leaving a college town, that's not conducive towards establishing long-term ideas of how community and how culture really works.
Right, that in a society that's very antithetical to a lot of the things that we're trying to do and firmly believe are important for raising children and just having family and all of these things, it makes it really hard to find that community, because really it's not easy to find like-minded people in today's day and age where, immorality is rampant and disagreement is something of the past. It's just angrily shouting your opinions and shutting everyone else down when they disagree with you. So that kind of adds an extra layer to the puzzle of how do we do this? Where do we find it? Can it even work?
Yeah, that's interesting to point out, because at least in my mind, this could be wildly inaccurate, but the things that Americans 60 years ago, maybe better close to say 70 or 80 years ago, just could wake up in the morning and walk down the street and assume their neighbors had in common with them, are points of contention now that get people in fights, especially online.
The online space.
That'll be a topic for a different day. But yeah, they're just morning, or God bless, just stuff like that even.
Or Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Oh, yeah, people 80 years ago, these things that you just kind of assumed you had in common with your neighbor unless told otherwise, and things that helped form some sense of cultural identity between you, based on these assumptions and then living out these assumptions, because more often than not, they were true.
Right.
Not accounting for human fallenness, obviously. We're all not great at living out the ideals that we hold, but
Clearly perfect unity in relationship is impossible in this life, but it's an aspiration and a goal.
This is true. This is true. I feel like I'm getting off topic again, though. So back to community.
So, in your personal opinion, in your mind, kind of as you think about community, what does it look like if done well? Like, I know everyone kind of has their own idea or thought of what community should be, and it's as numerous as, I don't want to say the stars in the sky, but almost, because you look online, you talk to people, and everyone has a little different idea of what they think that should look like.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm actually in the middle of putting on paper my thoughts about community. So you'll get a much more distilled version of this when I finish that blog post that I'm working on. I've got one of those coming out soon. It's hyperbolic, unfortunately. Well, fortunately, I think it serves its point. I think it has a literary point to it, the hyperbole that I'm really basing the blog post around. But I really am trying to dig into, like, what does it mean to have culture? What does it mean to have community? What do other people say? How does secular society treat real cultures that exist and real communities that exist? And what can we do in response to that? So it's been on my heart a lot recently, specifically. And I think the most basic definition that I could give probably is that community is really just the people you do life with. So that entails a proximity, right? In order to do life with people, you have to be with people. I think the two most operative parts of that sentence are the words do and the words with. With implying proximity, with implying the ability to engage with other people on a regular basis and to see this relationship as kind of being the way in which these multiple parties relate to each other. So you can't have a community by well, I mean, you could, but it would be like the most low-level possible definition of human relationship to interact with someone on Sundays. Say, maybe stick around at your church for a little while for a cup of coffee after service, and then go home and never see them again until next Sunday, and then do the same thing and never build on top of that. You're not doing much with them at that point. You're basically drinking a cup of coffee with them, and if that doesn't build into anything, you're not getting the width to the degree that you should probably have to in order to have a healthy community.
Right. Do you think there's something to be said about sharing in the Lord's Supper at Mass on a Sunday? But you're right, there is something that has to go deeper and be a more active role in that communion, in that community, that steps outside just Mass on Sunday, even though, like, the source and some of our faith and the greatest thing we can do together as a community is participating in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. There has to be more to it than that if you're living life together, because life, in as much as we might want it to be just Mass, just prayer, just adoration, for those disposed that way, like, that's not what the vast majority of us in lay life, in married life, raising children are called to. Like, we have to take care of the children, we have to go home and, go to work and be a part of the world, and not just in that worship at church itself.
Right. And I think it's an interesting distinction and a nuance. And thank you for kind of like reining me in there a little bit, because the focal point of all communion, especially as understood through Christian theology, is the Eucharist, is the Lord's Supper, is the liturgy. So I wasn't necessarily trying to dock on that, because like that is the best place community can start from.
Right.
I think I was thinking of it more from a either psychological or sociological sense of the word.
And that makes sense. I just thought,
right, because
together is
Because if we want to talk about like ontological spiritual realities, right? Like, yes, liturgy is the source and summit and highest focal point of communion and community. But those realities are not always reflected properly in the world around us. So we do have a community, a very real community with the people that we're going to Mass with, and with all Catholics, and with all Christians in the Brotherhood of Christ to an extent, though we may have degrees of separation within our churches. That is a real communion. That is a real community, and we need to foster that, because if we're not living out that community in our lives, then we're not acknowledging what's real, right?
Right.
So I guess I'm thinking more about how we live that out. What does it look like to live that out? And without the with, in regards to other modes of life. That's why I think with is so operative. The other word I focused on, right, was do, right? You're not just existing around people. It's not sufficient to exist around people and to think that that means that you're participating in community. There must be some sense of a mission, some sense of a
higher call, a higher purpose,
or even just some kind of unitive action, some kind of unitive action. It doesn't have to be particularly high. It could be as low as getting together and just like playing cards every once in a while, which, if you really wanted to wax philosophical on that, that's actually a pretty high mission, all things considered, for all the good that comes out of that communion and that community. But it doesn't have to be like organizing people to flood the streets and provide food to all the hungry and clothes to all the homeless people on the streets. It doesn't have to be that big. You don't have to make community turn into some kind of agent of social justice or social workers or charities in the secular sense of the word charity.
Right. When I think of higher call, higher purpose, I guess in my mind it has more to do with like a fulfillment of vocation, which is simple in a practical sense, but like really like your highest call is to fulfill your vocation and become a saint. So if you're living in community and doing things with those in your community in an ordered way, that would mean that you are helping each other in what you're doing, in what you're saying, in all of these things, and how you're participating in life together to reach that highest goal of your life. And that's what I think of when I think higher purpose. I don't necessarily think like social justice when I think higher purpose. Like I really mean it more in, I guess, simple everyday layman terms, like for things that we can all accomplish and things we're all called to do.
No, I agree with that. I think social justice is probably the wrong word to use there. It's close, and it's not necessarily wrong. I think activism would have been the word that I would have used there. I just couldn't think of the word activism. It doesn't have to be activism driven.
Right.
But yeah, if you can have those things, if you can have people that you're engaging with on a regular basis, and if you can not just be existing around them like ships passing in the night, if you can actually be doing something with them conducive towards your lives, that is, I think, the groundwork for some degree of community. I think those are the things that you need most.
Right. So like then I guess that would kind of, building off of that, what are the things that you need to do to go about building a community from the ground up? Because a lot of places or a lot of people, I feel, want that community. They want to build that. They want to foster it. But it just seems like this insurmountable task. Like, oh my gosh, where do we start? What do we do? Like, how does this look practically speaking, at least for someone like me who is very practical in application of things? Like, I have a hard time taking these lofty theoreticals, these philosophical ideas, and implementing them practically into my life. Like, I almost need someone to tell me, like, oh, hey, like, here's step 1, 2, 3, 4. Like, maybe not in that order, but, like, you kind of get what I'm saying. Like, how would you build that in a practical sense if there wasn't already a semblance of community that you're walking into where you are?
I think that's the important question, right? Because it used to be assumed in generations past that you were born into a community, you were raised in a community, and you had an idea of what that meant, enough so that if you had to leave that community, you were equipped to join another community or help start a new one. And we don't live in a society that does that anymore. We live in a society that is increasingly and extremely isolated, lonely. Suicide rates, especially in young men, are insanely high. I can't remember exactly how the statistic went, but I believe there was some statistic floating around, and I can't cite this or source this, so I apologize if this is wrong. But I believe there was something suggesting that there were more phone calls being made to police departments for reports of suicide or for people that they wanted the cops to come check on to talk them down from suicide than there was for things like homicide or aggression towards another person. So we live in frankly an anti-culture that hates these sorts of things and makes it intentionally difficult to find community, to form communities. So knowing how to start them is a skill that is important, but it's been largely lost, and I think we need to recover it. So how do we go about building communities, right? As I mentioned earlier, I think it really revolves. The phrase that always comes back to my mind is people doing life together, doing life with each other. And I think religion is pivotal to this. I think in order to find people that are, well, really, I don't want to say worth doing life with, because we do need to be reaching out to everyone, and we do need to be reaching out to evangelize the whole world, frankly. But I think it starts with like-minded people. And I think the best place to start when it comes to like-mindedness is people who have like-minded views on religion. It breaks my heart to see people who don't feel like they have a like-minded foundation with the people in their own church. I, as a Catholic from a relatively theologically solid part of the United States, have been blessed to not have to deal with this as much in my own churches, in the churches that I've been a part of, and the churches that I've visited. But I mean, I hear stories about my Protestant friends who go to church every Sunday because it's what they believe they're supposed to do, but the church they're going to is actively preaching things that they believe the Bible condemns, just because of the brand of Protestantism that they adhere to. They have some personal conviction that runs contrary to what the church is offering them. And maybe the pastor's solid, maybe the pastor's not, maybe it's coming from the council, maybe it's coming from the congregation themselves, just applying pressure how they can. But I, as a Catholic, have been very blessed, especially, and I think this is really important when it comes to dating. I hope that's not too much of a side tangent, but like, I knew with relative certainty that if I found a good Catholic girl to date, that would shore up so many of the things that a couple can disagree about. There would obviously be other important things, like just generally getting together well, having hobbies that don't pit each other against each other. But if we could have the same theological foundation, that I think that clears up the majority of compatibility issues between people in dating, and then also just generally in finding like-mindedness between friends. And it breaks my heart that people don't have that. But if I would encourage, I think starting with the church is very important. If it's not absolutely necessary to start community with the church, but if you can, that's a blessing to have access to.
So what about people that maybe grew up in a really close-knit family that want to establish community with their family, and I think that's a good place to start? Maybe they don't have a church family they can see eye to eye with, or, any number of things. Maybe they do, but maybe their family is a part of that church community. Like, is there a way to integrate family into community without making family the only community, or is that even a danger?
So I think I get what you're asking. Yes, it is possible to integrate family and community. The first off, and maybe this is just an optimist in me, but true community, good community, isn't going to cast any kind of class of people aside without needing to do so in order to protect itself. Needing to set up walls to protect the identity of the people inside the community. So families are very easily integrated into this. In fact, you see lots of young families trying, where you see communities popping up. Usually it's not the young and single people that are forming these communities. Usually it's the young married people with a toddler running around looking for someone to help them raise their kids together so they don't all individually lose their ever-loving minds. Those are the people who are trying to start communities these days, I feel like. So families should be very easily integrated into this. And there is, I can understand how if you live in a situation where you don't have these kinds of friends around you and you don't have this kind of kindred belief system within your church, and literally if the only thing you have is your family, I can see how it could be very tempting to make it to that family is the only thing. That sounded redundant. I can see how you'd be tempted to keep it that way. I can see how you'd be tempted to just look further inward to your own family to try and supply everything that the community needs. And there's nothing wrong with keeping your family at the heart of your communal life. But I do think it is disordered to think that it's okay to leave it there and to not reach out to the people around you and to not invite them into community living. For one thing, there's interesting power plays that exist within family units. Interesting ideas that come from just the result of living with people who have literally commandments from God telling them how to respect and obey members within the family. And you can get a lot of hurt feelings from that. Just choosing to move away and leave the community violate your obligations to your parents. People who don't have these tight-knit families that they're raised in wouldn't think twice about that, but if you live in a very deeply rooted family who's been in the same place for generations and generations and generations, right? You think of some of the Christian sects. I hope that's not a derogatory word, but like you look at the Amish or the Mennonites and you see how tight-knit they are, and you see how leaving the community drives wedges between family members to the point where you have family members that won't talk to each other anymore. And I think that is a negative aspect of conflating the larger community and the family community, and making them too much of the same thing, making them too synonymous with each other. I think it's necessary to reach out to other people around you, to your neighbors, to your coworkers, to the people at your church I already mentioned, and not strictly do life with your own family. I think that's very important. And part of it, right, I have a friend who was talking about this at length the other day, is that as Christians, we believe that we're all descendants of Adam and Eve. We all came from unity. That there was not one tribe of people over here and then magically through some other entirely spontaneous human generation, some other humans cropped up over here and they were separate and they were different from each other. Any kind of separateness and difference we see between ourselves and other groups of people, whether that be our neighbors, the people at our church, the people at our work, those very real divides between us are not divides that occurred naturally. They are divides that are fractures from where in our human fallenness we have set ourselves opposed to each other. So there is no other, is what that really boils down to, and is what that really means, is that I might look at this person over here and say, that person is entirely separate from me. That person has nothing to do with the way I'm living my life, the things that I believe in.
They're one of those people.
Yeah, those people. And while it's good to acknowledge the very real differences between us, because we need to actively work to heal those wounds, we can't act like they're not there or else we won't heal them. right? You see those people who have the medical condition where they don't feel pain, and it actually is very damaging to them because they can't properly assess what's wrong. Therefore, they can't properly fix things when things go wrong.
Right.
They burn themselves and do actual damage to their bodies because they can't assess when things are actually out of order. So we need to be able to assess when things are out of order, when there are differences between people, when these ruptures have sprung up. But ultimately, we have to look at all of human society as a single homogeneous pane of glass that got shattered. And we are standing on one piece of glass, looking at people standing on another piece of that glass. And the divide between us is manufactured. And it shouldn't be there in a perfect world. And we need to heal those over, bring Christ to those people, and bring them into our communions and into our communities.
And I think that would be an important aspect too, is like realizing that humility is an important part of community, because it takes humility to realize that they're not the only ones who are struggling with some vice, with some issue kind of a deal. We all have our own vices. We all have our own faults. We're all fallen. And to not look at ourselves as better than anybody, really, because, I think it's St. Augustine that says, like, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of that line. Every saint can become the greatest sinner, and the greatest sinner can become the greatest saint. Like, really, there's, like you're saying, nothing truly dividing us. It's that we're all fallen, and we all have these biases, these prejudices that arise from pride in thinking that we're better, or in thinking that maybe someone else is lesser in some way because of the specific vice they struggle with. And we have to really evaluate our motives in order to integrate ourselves into a community and not just make it fall apart or become a problem within that community. Because, part of being in community as well as living with each other is being able to get along with and work through issues and these different things.
Right.
Which kind of brings up a different point. Like, how would one deal with conflict in a community? Like,
right.
How does that look, practically speaking, in a healthy sense? Because obviously conflict is a thing. Like, we don't all see things eye to eye. Like, no one does. Right.
It's going to depend. It's going to depend on case to case, because some conflicts, the nature is such that if this does not resolve itself, it can threaten the identity of the culture. It can threaten the identity of the community. Say someone in the community begins living the sort of life that puts very real dangers in your midst. I'm thinking things that would endanger children, potentially. Those kinds of issues need to be resolved very quickly, and usually probably with the exclusion of someone from your community, if that is something you're dealing with. If it's putting children in danger, that's a line that I draw for sure. We can't be doing that. We can't be putting our children in danger. There's too much of that in the world right now. There just is. However, there is something very real to be said about being very, very, very weary to use that kind of ability to excise someone utterly from a community. We live in a culture that's rampant with that. And part of it has to do with how we've put so much of our idea of community into online spaces, into online communities, into who we see on social media. And if we're just tired of dealing with someone, it does not take much at all to just block them, and you never have to see them again. Or you can even soft block them by like unfollowing them in such a way that like it doesn't tell them that you've unfollowed them, or even staying followed to them but just telling social media that you don't want to see more of their posts on your feed. That's something you can do depending on what kind of media you're looking at.
We just have all kinds of silencing techniques. It's just the way it is.
Yeah, you can. And you can't silence people in reality. Or you shouldn't. You shouldn't silence people anywhere. Because part of what makes community so great is the same thing that makes family so great, is that if your kid or your brother is just the most annoying, ridiculous, terrible person on earth, it doesn't matter. I mean, it does. And it affects a lot of things. But what it doesn't affect is that you can't just kick them out of the family. There is a very real sense to which you still have obligations to this person. That person has obligations to you. And as long as it's not putting you in like a as long as it's not putting you in danger, right? There's limits. There's a time for healthy separation between people, but you can't pick your family. And there's this whole saying that I really hate at this point. That's like, oh, family's more important because you can, or friends are more important because you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family. And it's like, well, first off, ideally, you shouldn't be able to pick your friends either. Your community should be the people you exist around, not the people you've chosen to deign with your presence and your amazingness into their lives. You have not condescended to insert yourself into your lives. You shouldn't be able to really pick either. Friends being a synonym here for community, I guess. Not friends in like obviously you can choose who you like and who you don't like. Like I can't force you not to do that. But your communities should not be choices either. And then the idea that it's somehow of greater value because it was a choice. That also rubs me the wrong way.
It drives me nuts too.
Because, yeah, family is clearly superior than, and because it's not chosen, because it is a gift received from God that you in trust said, give me what you got. We are going to start a family. We are going to have kids. We are going to make this work, not knowing if in 20 years my spouse is going to have dementia, not knowing if in 2 years we could have a kid who grows up to be the most nightmarish, ridiculous person in the world, who becomes some kind of drug addict to a degree, becomes a drug dealer to a degree, becomes a homicidal maniac to a degree. We don't have these choices. We don't get to make these choices. It's an act of trust in God to say, I know you're good. I know you're going to take care of me. I know you're not going to put me in a situation where I can't do your will. Mm-hmm. And in love, I'm saying, give me what you got. And community should have a sense of that, though obviously not to the same exact degree as family. Family is a little more primordial than that. Family is a little more essential than that. But
and I think that is partially a result of it being your vocation.
Right.
Especially as the parents of the children.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not so much as the children of the parents, but even then, like, you were a part of your parents' vocation, so there's a closer tie there than there would be in community where you're planted, kind of a thing. I see that a lot.
That didn't give too much practical advice on how to deal with conflicts in a community, though. So I do want to try and address that a little bit before we move on. We've talked a little bit about what not to do, right? Or at least we've hinted at it. What you can't do is you can't just excise people from your life. You can't just act like certain members of the community don't exist and avoid them at all costs and beat yourself up when they inevitably do continue to exist despite your firmest wishes that they did not. That is not an option that we have as Christians, and that also is just not an option that we have as material, fleshy bodies living in a world where our whims don't determine who exists at a given moment. We can't just wish people out of existence. Right. We cannot do these things. So excising people from the community like that is not an option that we have access to. And we shouldn't have access to it. It's not something that should be desired either. It really brings back that we have an obligation to dedicate ourselves to conflict resolution, to trying to hear each other out, to understand where each other is, to put up borders and healthy boundaries where they need to be put up, but understanding that those need to be prudent and in various stages, not immediately escalating too far any one given way. There is an art to conflict resolution, and there is a reason that in various world religions there is ample time dedicated to conflict resolution between parties. It's almost this virtuous supernatural feat to be able to take people who disagree about something and somehow work out a solution that works for both parties. There's something religious about the ability to do something like that. And we don't have that art anymore. We've lost that, but it can be developed with practice, with humility, with going easy on yourself when it doesn't work.
And I think prudence as well.
With prudence. And it'll be a lot easier if you approach these things coming from a place of actual love. If you really, truly will the good of the other, and you don't go into this thinking, me, this is how you've hurt me, this is what's terrible about me. If you are actually looking to will what is in the best interest of the other person, understanding that that will not mean hurting yourself, because in God's will, he wills the good of all of us. And in willing the good for one person, it never requires him to will the detriment of another. So knowing that self-flagellation is not a required part of loving the other, I think that helps contextualize it a lot. I think that brings a lot to the table.
Right, and I think patience too. Because maybe you can't solve a problem in one conversation, but maybe over the course of several weeks or several months or several years of like having conversations and patiently explaining your side, or patiently listening, or just patiently waiting for the conversation to happen again or to happen at all. I think that's also important to remember too, is that it's not ever usually, I mean, very rare circumstances, but very rarely is it ever going to be like an instant fix, a one conversation fix, like a one time we're going to talk about this, come to an agreement or a compromise, and it's all going to be fixed. Like, we really have to be patient with ourselves and with those in the community that we're in conflict with or in disagreement with, to work through the problem at hand. I think, anyways. It just takes a lot of supernatural and natural virtue in a lot of different areas to work through conflict.
There's a degree to which conflict resolution doesn't necessarily always need to have supernatural virtue. And the only reason I specify that is because it's not like non-Christians are utterly bereft of the ability to reach conflict resolution. It is a lot of natural virtue there. But the supernatural virtues, the ability to be patient, the ability to love the will, or to truly desire, to will the love, to will the good of the other. That's what I was trying to say there. Things like that are only found in supernatural virtue and Christian perfection. To have faith and hope in these situations, to bring charity and love into these situations. That perfects, I think, the ability to actually have real conflict resolution that doesn't just exist for the sake of exerting the will of the one over the other, or trying to get one's will as much as one is capable to without inviting worse things upon himself. Because without love, that's what conflict resolution becomes. A way to exert one's own will, minimizing the negative consequences he can bring upon himself.
And that's really easy to do. I think it's really important to check notice there, because, yeah, it's really easy to devolve into that mindset or that approach, unfortunately.
Hey everybody, Nick here. This is the end of our inaugural episode of the Heart Speaks to Heart podcast. For the rest of this conversation, stay tuned for part 2 coming very soon. If you care for more of these kinds of conversations, feel free to find us everywhere at the Three Hearts Homestead. And be sure to tune in for future conversations like this between Maddie and I as Heart Speaks to Heart. God bless and have a good day. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sic ut erat in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula